On the night of the 19th of October, 1963, a 54-year-old woman lay down in a small house on Chester Row in London and swallowed a massive dose of sleeping pills. She did not wake up. A year earlier, she had been answering telephones for an organization called the Samaritans, trained to talk strangers out of doing exactly what she was about to do. Her name was Diana. Her father was Winston Churchill. Contrast that with a maternity room in London, 54 years earlier, when a newborn girl was placed in the arms of a young member of Parliament, who turned to his friend David Lloyd George and declared her the prettiest child he had ever seen. How does the man credited with saving Western civilization end up burying, burning through, or simply losing 4 of his 5 children before his own life was through? In the next few minutes, you will discover what was found on the floor of a Suffolk dining room after a carving knife was hurled across the table by Churchill's only son. You will learn what a telegram, delayed for weeks by a frightened governess in a rented seaside cottage, cost a 2-year-old girl named Duckadilly. And you will understand why, for the rest of his life, Winston Churchill kept a bench behind a small stone cross in a quiet Oxfordshire churchyard, a bench where he sat alone and where no one, not even his wife, was permitted to disturb him. What you are about to hear is not a story about Britain's greatest Prime Minister. It is a story about what it costs the people closest to a man who belongs to history before he belongs to them. That bench, that grave, that small stone cross behind the church at Blaydon, hold on to it. It returns at the end of this film, and by then you will understand exactly what it means. What you are about to hear has not been told this way before. Stay with it. Diana Spencer Churchill was born on the 11th of July, 1909, at 33 Eccleston Square in London. The first of 5 children born to Winston Churchill, then a rising minister in a Liberal government, and his wife Clementine Hosier. 4 more would follow across the next 13 years. Randolph in 1911, Sarah in 1914, Marigold in 1918, and finally Mary in 1922. They were born into a household that looked, from the outside, like a fairy tale. Blenheim Palace stood behind them as ancestral backdrop. Political power surrounded them daily. But inside that household, something quieter and colder was already taking shape. Winston and Clementine Churchill hired a succession of nannies to raise their children, following the standard practice of their class. But Winston's career was consuming, and Clementine's own health and social obligations pulled her away for weeks and months at a stretch. Their youngest daughter, Mary, would say it plainly, decades later, describing what it was like to grow up in that house. Father always came first, second and third. It was not said with bitterness. It was said as a fact of the household's architecture, the same way you would describe which room got the morning sun. Diana and her brother Randolph grew up with an added, stranger burden. During the years of the suffragette movement, when militant activists made kidnapping threats against prominent political families, the 2 eldest children were escorted on their walks through Holland Park by plainclothes detectives, bodyguards disguised as nannies and family friends, watching a 6-year-old girl skate on the ice. There was affection in the household, real affection. Winston doted on his children when he was present, invented games, wrote them tender letters when he travelled. But presence was the operative word, and presence was rationed. The seed of what would follow was planted here, in the gap between a father who loved his children fiercely in the abstract and a father who was, for enormous stretches of their childhoods, simply elsewhere, in the House of Commons, in the Sudan, in South Africa, in the trenches, in the countless obligations of a man who had already decided, by his own account, that his life was a preparation for a destiny larger than any nursery. None of the 5 children would escape the consequences of that arrangement entirely. One would not survive childhood at all. We move now to 1921, to a rented cottage on the Kent coast, and to a telegram that took too long to send. By 1922, the Churchill family had reached what looked, from any reasonable distance, like its high water mark. Winston had married Clementine Hosier in September 1908 at St. Margaret's, Westminster, a marriage that would prove, unlike so many of his political friendships, durable and genuine. They had moved through a sequence of grand addresses: Eccleston Square, Admiralty House, Downing Street itself during his years as Chancellor, and in September 1922 they purchased Chartwell, a country house in Kent with sweeping views across the Weald, for a price that would eventually run past £5,000 in improvements alone. It would remain the family seat for the rest of Winston's life. That same month, their 5th and final child, Mary, was born. By any external measure, this was a family accumulating everything: 5 children, a country estate, a political career that had already carried Winston through the Admiralty, the Colonial Office, and toward the Exchequer. Contemporaries described the household at Chartwell as vibrant, chaotic, filled with pets, painting easels, half-built brick walls that Winston laid himself, and children running between them. Everything, everything. But beneath the surface of that vibrant, chaotic household, a fault line was already visible, and it had opened 3 years earlier, in 1918, with the arrival of a golden-haired baby girl, Winston nicknamed Duckadilly. Marigold Frances Churchill was born on the 15th of November, 1918, only 4 days after the armistice that ended the First World War. Winston adored her instantly and completely. In a letter to Clementine on Valentine's Day 1921, he wrote that she took a great interest in everything said to her or shown to her. The small, doting observation of a father genuinely charmed by his youngest daughter. Within 18 months, everything would change. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing about the Churchill household in the early 1920s. Its warmth was real, but its supervision was thin, and that thinness was about to be tested. In August 1921, the family's routine sent Marigold, along with her siblings, to a rented cottage on the coast at Broadstairs in Kent, under the care of a French nursery governess named Mademoiselle Rose. Winston was occupied with his duties as colonial secretary. Clementine had gone north to stay with the Duke and Duchess of Westminster in Cheshire. It was an ordinary arrangement for a family of their station, the kind of arrangement that had worked, without incident, for years. Marigold had already suffered a cough and a cold earlier in the year. It seemed to pass. Then it returned. This time it did not pass. The infection that had settled in the little girl's throat began to worsen, a sore throat that deepened into something systemic, something that would later be understood as septicemia, blood poisoning racing through a body with no antibiotics available anywhere on earth to stop it. And here is the detail that no biography of Winston Churchill, the statesman, has ever fully reckoned with. Mademoiselle Rose, watching a toddler grow sicker by the day, hesitated. She did not immediately alert Clementine. According to the family's own later account, given by Mary Soames decades afterward, the governess waited before sending word, frightened, perhaps, of being blamed, or simply unable to grasp how quickly the illness was accelerating. By the time the telegram reached Clementine in Cheshire, urgency had already curdled into emergency. I told you about a delayed telegram. Remember it. It returns before the end of this film, because Marigold would not be the last Churchill child whose worst moment unfolded while someone who should have been present was somewhere else entirely, learning the truth too late to change it. What her spouse, her mother, her father, did not know, could not have known, in that gap of days, was how little time remained. Clementine Churchill arrived in Broadstairs to find her youngest daughter already beyond saving. Winston was informed and caught the next train south, but by the time father and mother stood together at Marigold's bedside, the specialist summoned to attend her could offer nothing but confirmation of what was already obvious. On the 23rd of August, 1921, Marigold Frances Churchill died. She was 2 years old and would have turned 3 in November. The precise time is not recorded with the forensic exactness later ages would demand of a public death, but the location is a rented cottage on the Kent coast, a sick room that should have held nothing more dangerous than a summer cold, and 2 parents who had travelled with the unhurried confidence of people who believed, wrongly, that they still had time. Clementine's response, in the immediate aftermath, was described by her own daughter Mary, decades later, in a single unforgettable sentence. The whole thing shook her deeply. Winston's response was quieter, more contained, and in some ways more haunting. In a letter to Clementine the following month, he wrote that he still felt the hurt of the Duckadilly, using, even in grief, the pet name he had given her. You need to understand what this meant for a man who had built his entire public identity around composure under fire. Winston Churchill had already survived cavalry charges, been taken prisoner in a war, watched men die at close range on 3 continents. None of it, by every account left behind, touched him the way this did. Marigold was buried at Kensal Green Cemetery in London, not, at the time, with the rest of the family, who would eventually be laid to rest together at St. Martin's Church in Blaydon, near Blenheim Palace. A stonemason named Eric Gill carved her original memorial, an ornate crucifix on an 8-sided pillar. It would later be stolen and replaced with a reproduction. Here is something the official record has never fully accounted for. For the rest of his life, whenever Winston Churchill visited that grave, he would sit alone on a bench positioned behind the headstone, and he was, by family agreement, not to be disturbed under any circumstances while he sat there. You have just watched a father lose a child to an infection that within 20 years, penicillin would have cured in days. Sit with that for a moment. It was never going to be fixed, and it was never going to stop mattering, not to him, and, as we will see, not to the 4 children who lived on in the shadow of the one who did not. Here is the part that no biography focused on Winston Churchill the statesman has ever fully explained: what Marigold's death did to the family that remained. Publicly, the Churchills carried on almost immediately. Barely 2 weeks after the funeral, Clementine returned to London with the surviving children for the new school term, while Winston went on to Scotland, a decision that, viewed from a modern vantage point, looks almost incomprehensible. A recent biographer even used the word abandonment to describe it, but those closest to the family understood it differently. Winston's sense of duty, forged over decades of public service, did not switch off in grief. It absorbed the grief and kept moving, the way it always had. What the world did not see was what happened inside the nursery that remained. Diana was 12, Randolph was 10, Sarah was not yet 7, Mary had not yet been born. 3 children old enough to understand what had happened to their little sister were now growing up in a household permanently marked by an absence no one discussed openly, presided over by parents whose capacity for warmth was already stretched thin by circumstance, and now further strained by unspoken grief. There is a pattern that biographers and psychologists alike have long observed in families that suffer the sudden death of a young child. Surviving siblings often absorb, without being told, a set of unspoken rules: do not need too much, do not cause worry, do not be the reason for more pain. Whether or not the Churchill children were told this explicitly, the household structure enforced it regardless. The parents, who were already frequently absent, became, for a period, even less emotionally available, consumed by a loss they rarely spoke of aloud. It is impossible to prove that Marigold's death directly caused what happened to her siblings in the decades that followed. No historian would make that claim with certainty, and neither will this film. But it is not a coincidence worth ignoring either, that in the years ahead, 3 of the 4 surviving Churchill children would develop severe, sustained problems with alcohol, depression, or both, problems that would follow them, in one form or another, until their deaths. The household did not collapse. It simply hardened around the hole where a daughter used to be, and the 4 children who remained kept growing up inside it. This was not the first time, but it was different in one specific way. This time, no infection was to blame. This time, it was choices, made across decades, by people who were, by then, adults. Diana Churchill's first marriage, to John Milner Bailey, the son of a South African gold mining millionaire, took place in December 1932 at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, the same church where her parents had married. It was, by every account, a dazzling society wedding. It lasted barely a year before the couple separated, and the marriage ended in divorce in 1935. Diana married again within months, to a rising conservative politician named Duncan Sandys. This marriage endured 25 years and produced 3 children, Julian, Edwina, and Celia, but it too ended, in divorce, in 1960. The public response to a divorced daughter of a former Prime Minister was, by the standards of mid-century Britain, a source of quiet social discomfort rather than open scandal. Winston and Clementine's own social standing shielded Diana from the worst of it. But the private response, inside the family, was different. Diana had suffered several nervous breakdowns across the 1950s, a fact her family did not broadcast, but did not entirely hide either. She underwent treatment that included electroconvulsive therapy. Then, in 1962, something appeared to shift. Diana legally reverted to the name Diana Churchill after her ex-husband remarried. Her relationship with her mother, long strained, began to warm. She became a regular visitor to Chartwell, and in the summer of 1962, she took the decision that would come to look, in hindsight, almost unbearably ironic. She became an unpaid volunteer for the Samaritans, the organization founded specifically to counsel people contemplating suicide. By 1963, with her daughter Edwina, newly married, and a grandchild recently born, those closest to Diana believed her life had finally settled into something like peace. I told you about a woman answering telephones for a suicide prevention organization. Remember that badge she wore, that training she completed, that year she spent talking strangers back from the edge? It returns, and it does not return kindly. If Diana's crisis unfolded quietly, behind drawn curtains and private clinics, her brother Randolph's unfolded in full public view. In the pages of newspapers his own father was too prominent to shield him from. Randolph Churchill had been raised, almost from birth, to believe he was his father's political heir. He entered Parliament unopposed for Preston in 1940, during the wartime electoral truce, and served with genuine distinction during the war itself, parachuting into occupied Yugoslavia to liaise with Tito's partisans, serving alongside the SAS in North Africa. But Randolph lost his seat in 1945 and was never returned to the Commons again, despite repeated attempts across the following decade. What the press was mocking through the 1940s and 50s, the failed election campaigns, the drunken outbursts, the public rows, was not actually the deepest wound. The real wound was something else entirely. a son who had been told his entire life that greatness was his birthright, watching that birthright fail to materialize year after year, while his father's own legend only grew larger and more unreachable. Randolph's marriage to Pamela Digby in 1939 collapsed under the weight of his compulsive gambling and drinking. She would later describe, through friends and biographers, a husband who accrued gambling debts even while crossing the Atlantic on troop transport, forcing her to sell her own wedding presents to cover what he owed. They divorced in 1946. A second marriage, to June Osborne, also ended in divorce, finalized in 1961. His temper became, in certain circles, a kind of dark legend in itself. The historian Martin Gilbert, who worked closely with Randolph in his final years on the official biography of Winston Churchill, later gave a documented, first-hand account of one evening at Randolph's home, Stour House, when an editor's remark provoked Randolph into seizing a carving knife from the dinner table, brandishing it while trembling with fury, before hurling it to the floor and storming from the room. "I told you about that carving knife in Section 1. Here is what it means." By the 1960s, the son who was supposed to inherit his father's political legacy had instead inherited something closer to his grandfather's volatility. The same Lord Randolph Churchill, dead at 45, whose own decline a previous generation had quietly explained away in the press. Randolph never recovered the trajectory he had been promised. By the early 1960s, 3 of the surviving Churchill children had, in their own ways, withdrawn from the versions of themselves the public once expected. Randolph retreated to Stour House in East Bergholt, Suffolk. The property locals nicknamed him the Beast of, for his reputation with tradesmen he refused to pay, and rows that could be heard down the lane. There, in 1960, after decades of failed campaigns and failed marriages, he finally received the one appointment that mattered more to him than any parliamentary seat: his father's approval to write the official biography of Winston Churchill's life. At last his life had found a purpose. Randolph's own son later wrote of him. Sarah Churchill, meanwhile, had built and then very publicly lost an entirely different kind of life. She had eloped in 1936 with the Austrian-born comedian Vic Oliver, nearly twice her age, against her parents' explicit wishes. Winston reportedly described him, in a private letter to Clementine, as not a bad man, but common as dirt. That marriage ended in divorce in 1945. Sarah rebuilt a genuine acting career on stage and in film, most famously opposite Fred Astaire in the 1951 musical Royal Wedding, and served with real distinction during the war as a photographic intelligence officer with the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, working directly on the interpretation of reconnaissance images. Her second marriage, to the society photographer Anthony Beauchamp, took her to the United States. It too deteriorated, and the couple separated in 1955. 2 years later, in August 1957, Beauchamp was found dead of an overdose of sleeping pills in his London flat, ruled a suicide. The children's own experience of watching their parents move through this pattern, marriage, breakdown, headline, retreat, went largely undocumented in Sarah's or Randolph's own words, but it shaped how each of them was received by the public that had once adored their father unconditionally, with a curious, embarrassed sympathy, the sense of a family whose brightest member had used up all the luck. Here, at last, comes the payoff of the first of the 3 details I promised you at the start of this film: the delayed telegram from 1921, sent by a frightened governess to a mother playing tennis in Cheshire. It was never explained publicly, never investigated, never blamed on anyone by name. It simply became one more thing the family absorbed and did not discuss. The first, but not the last, moment when Churchill family silence cost more than anyone could measure at the time. His name was John Gilbert Wynant, and he arrived in Britain in March 1941 as the United States ambassador to the court of St. James's, a tall, shy, Lincoln-esque figure who would spend the next 5 years working almost daily alongside Winston Churchill during the most consequential stretch of the Second World War. He also, somewhere along the way, fell in love with Sarah. Wynant was married, 25 years Sarah's senior, and the affair, conducted discreetly through weekend visits to Chequers and quiet dinners in London, unfolded almost entirely out of public view, even as the two were photographed dancing together at the Cairo and Tehran conferences in late 1943. Winston Churchill, by most accounts, suspected the relationship and never confronted it directly. The war effort, and the American alliance Wynant represented, mattered more than a private complication in his daughter's life. What Wynant gave Sarah, in those years, was something none of the men in her life before or after quite managed: the sense of being genuinely seen by a man operating at the absolute center of world events, rather than merely tolerated as the daughter of one. What he cost her, in the end, was almost impossible to calculate. When the war concluded and Sarah chose not to marry him, prioritizing her own independence, relocating instead to Rome to pursue her acting career, Wynant was left in a marriage he had never wanted and a peacetime Washington that no longer needed him the way wartime London once had. In November 1947, John Gilbert Wynant took his own life. Sarah rarely spoke publicly about what she felt in the aftermath, but those who knew her well later traced a straight line from that loss to the drinking that would come to define the next 3 decades of her life. The same drinking that would land her, more than once, in the back of a London police van and eventually behind the walls of Holloway Prison for a short, humiliating stretch on remand. He never recovered. Neither, in a slower and more public way, did she. By the mid-1960s, it is worth pausing on each of the surviving Churchill children in turn, because the costs, added together, are staggering. Diana, divorced twice, hospitalized for nervous breakdowns, treated with electroconvulsive therapy, dead by her own hand in 1963 at the age of 54, 1 year after joining an organization built to save people exactly like her. Randolph, divorced twice, a failed political career spanning more than 2 decades, a body wrecked by alcohol even after he had stopped drinking entirely on his doctor's orders, his liver already beyond saving by the time he quit. Sarah, 3 marriages, 2 of her husbands dead, one by his own hand, one of a brain tumor. After barely a year of marriage, she called the happiest of her life. A series of arrests for drunk and disorderly conduct that made tabloid headlines her father was powerless to prevent, and a childhood spent, as she put it herself, in her own memoir, learning to burn our scandals at both ends. And Marigold, the 4th child, who never reached the age where any of this would have been possible to record, because she did not survive past the age of 2. Here is the second of the 3 teasers I promised you at the beginning. That carving knife hurled across the dining table at Stour House was never simply about Randolph's temper. It was, biographers have since suggested, the visible surface of a much older and quieter wound. A boy who watched his father become the most famous man alive, while feeling, in his own words to friends, that he could never live up to what that required. And a father who, by his own admission, held a deep animal love for his son, but confessed that every time we meet, we seem to have a bloody row. The generational pattern is impossible to miss. Winston's own father, Lord Randolph Churchill, died at 45 of a degenerative illness that left him slurring, staggering, and cognitively diminished in his final years, while his young son watched from the sidelines of a household that offered him almost no direct affection at all. Winston broke that pattern of coldness with genuine warmth toward his own children, but he could not break the pattern of absence, and absence, it turned out, carried its own cost, one generation later, in a different currency. For Randolph, the 1960s arrived as a slow, irreversible reckoning with a body he had spent 30 years abusing. In 1964, he was struck down by bronchopneumonia so severe it left him able only to whisper. Later that same year, surgeons removed a tumour from his lung, a tumour that in a twist his old friend Evelyn Waugh could not resist mocking, turned out to be entirely benign. It was a typical triumph of modern science, Waugh remarked, to find the one part of Randolph which was not malignant and to remove it. The financial and physical specifics of Randolph's decline were, by 1968, unmistakable. A doctor who warned him that continued heavy drinking would kill him within 6 months. A decision to stop cold, which he did, with genuine willpower, and a diagnosis of cirrhosis of the liver that no amount of sobriety could reverse, because the damage of 3 decades of drinking was already done. What he kept, through all of it, was the work. Randolph had finally, at nearly 50 years old, been given his father's blessing in 1960 to write the official biography of Winston Churchill's life, and he pursued it, in his final years, with an intensity his friends said they had never seen from him before. He published the first volume, covering his father's youth, in 1966. He was still working on the second when Robert Kennedy, who had contracted Randolph to write a biography of his own assassinated brother, was himself shot dead in June 1968, the very day, as it happened, that Randolph Churchill's own body finally gave out. He was found the next morning by one of his researchers, at his home, Stour House, in East Bergholt, Suffolk. The cause of death was recorded as heart failure. He was 57 years old. Sarah, watching her brother's decline from a distance shaped by her own struggles, would later describe her family's private griefs, with unusual candour, in her 1981 memoir, Keep on Dancing, one of the only members of that generation of Churchills willing to put the family's private wounds into print, in her own words, while she was still alive to answer for them. Diana Churchill's final days unfolded in a small house at 58 Chester Row, in Westminster, the kind of modest London address that would have seemed unremarkable to anyone who did not know whose daughter lived there. By 1963, her life appeared, to those around her, more settled than it had been in years. Her divorce from Duncan Sandys was 3 years behind her. Her daughter Edwina had married. A grandchild had recently been born. She had, for over a year, been volunteering with the Samaritans, answering the telephone for strangers in crisis, trained in exactly the techniques that might, in theory, have talked her back from the edge of her own crisis, had anyone been there to use them on her. On the night of the 19th of October 1963, alone in that house, Diana took a massive overdose of barbiturates. She was found the following day, the 20th of October. The coroner's inquest that followed reached the only conclusion the evidence allowed: suicide. Her estate was valued, on probate, at £59,259. Here, finally, is the payoff of the third detail promised at the start of this film. The Samaritan's badge Diana wore into that small office once a week for over a year was not incidental. It was, in hindsight, one of the loudest signals anyone close to her could have received. A woman who had spent her adult life absorbing other people's crises, finally, quietly, trying to absorb her own, the only way she knew how, by learning the professional language of survival and hoping, perhaps, that fluency alone would be enough to save her. It was not. Winston Churchill was 88 years old when his eldest daughter died, already in serious physical decline himself, less than 2 years from his own death. Those closest to him say he rarely spoke of Diana's death publicly, and almost never in writing, the same near-total silence he had maintained 4 decades earlier over the loss of Marigold. It was, by then, a family habit. Grief absorbed, rarely spoken, carried privately for the rest of a life. She never recovered the peace she had briefly found. Neither, in the end, did the family's silence around her. Winston Churchill died on the 24th of January 1965, at the age of 90, having outlived 2 of his own children, Marigold in 1921, Diana in 1963, and having watched a third, Randolph, walk for an hour in the bitter cold of his father's own state funeral procession, despite not having fully recovered from lung surgery himself. Randolph would follow his father into the grave, barely 3 years later, in June 1968. Of the 5 children born to Winston and Clementine Churchill, only 2 would live past the age of 70. Sarah, who died on the 24th of September 1982, at the age of 67, after decades of alcoholism, finally caught up with a body worn down by drink and repeated hospitalizations, and Mary, the youngest, who would go on to outlive every one of her siblings by decades. Mary's path stood in almost total contrast to her brother and sisters. She married Christopher Soames, a conservative politician and future ambassador, in 1947. The marriage lasted 40 years until his death in 1987, and produced 5 children of their own: Nicholas, Emma, Jeremy, Charlotte, and Rupert. Mary went on to write acclaimed biographies of her own mother, and to edit the personal correspondence between her parents into a book that became, for historians, one of the most valuable windows into the Churchill marriage ever published. By 1982, with Sarah's death, Mary Soames became the last surviving child of Winston Churchill, a distinction she would hold, alone, for the next 32 years. In 2019, decades after her own death was still years away, Mary made a final, quiet arrangement. She had Marigold's remains moved from Kensal Green Cemetery in London to the family plot at St Martin's Church in Blaydon, reuniting the sister who had died a stranger to her. Mary was not yet born when Marigold died, with the rest of the family at last. It had been, family members said, their father's long-held wish that all his children rest together. It took nearly a century to finish granting it. Only one of the 3 curiosity threads planted at the start of this film remains fully open. We return to it now, at the bench behind the grave, where this story began. For decades, the popular account of the Churchill children treated their struggles as isolated personal failings. Randolph's drinking dismissed as simple weakness of character, Diana's death filed away as a private tragedy, unconnected to anything larger, Sarah's arrests treated as tabloid embarrassment, rather than the visible symptom of a much older grief. The release of family correspondence, diaries, and memoirs across the following decades, including Mary Soames's own published letters between her parents, and Sarah's unusually candid 1981 memoir, has allowed a more complete picture to emerge. What Randolph, Diana, and Sarah were not, in the light of that fuller record, was simply weak, or spoiled, or self-destructive by nature. What the documented pattern actually shows is something closer to a structural inheritance. 5 children, raised inside a household organized entirely around one parent's world historical ambitions, cared for with real love but insufficient consistency, and then thrust, From adolescence onward, into a public spotlight none of them had chosen, and none of them could ever fully escape, always measured against a father whose legend only grew larger with each passing year. The most heartbreaking detail to emerge only in later decades is perhaps the smallest one: Mary Soames's own recollection, given in an interview late in her life, that her mother didn't blame the governess in any way for the delay that cost Marigold her life. An act of forgiveness that reads, on reflection, less like grace, and more like a family already so practiced in absorbing loss quietly that even a fatal, preventable failure produced no outward anger at all. What the press once called Randolph's temper was, in fact, something closer to grief, with nowhere to go. What history once called Diana's private breakdown was, in fact, the predictable consequence of a childhood spent competing for a father's attention with an empire. What was once dismissed as Sarah's scandal was, in fact, a woman who had learned, from the cradle onward, that composure in public and collapse in private was simply how her family survived. This is not a story about the children of Britain's greatest wartime leader. It is, as promised at the start of this film, a story about the cost of being loved by a man who belonged to history before he belonged to them, and about how that cost was paid, unevenly and often silently, by 5 people who did not choose the households they were born into any more than their father chose the century that made him famous. Return, now, to that bench. It sits behind a small stone marker at St. Martin's Church in Blaydon, near Blenheim Palace, where Winston Churchill was born and where he chose, in the end, to be buried. For over 40 years, whenever the weight of his public life became too much to carry, he would come to that churchyard alone and sit on that bench, positioned deliberately behind his daughter Marigold's grave, and no one, not his private secretaries, not his closest aides, not even Clementine, was permitted to interrupt him while he sat there. Today, all 5 of his children rest in that same churchyard. Diana, Randolph, Sarah, Mary, who joined them in 2014, and Marigold, moved there in 2019 at Mary's own request, decades after her death, so that the daughter who died a stranger to 3 of her siblings could finally lie among the family that never stopped, in its own quiet and imperfect way, wanting her home. The question this film opened with was how a man who saved a nation could not save his own children. The answer, in the end, is not a solution. It is an observation, and it is this: Winston Churchill gave everything he had to Britain, and what was left over, genuine but limited, went to 5 children who needed more consistency than a man carrying the weight of an empire, and later a world war, ever had left to give. He built a legacy that changed the course of the 20th century. It cost him a daughter to sepsis in a rented seaside cottage while he was 200 miles away. It cost him a son's political future to a fury the son could never fully name or control. It cost him a second daughter to an overdose in a small London house, 1 year after she had learned, professionally, exactly how to save someone else's life. It cost a third daughter 3 marriages, 2 dead husbands, and a reputation she spent her final years trying to reclaim in her own words, before anyone else could write them for her. Only one child, the youngest, born the same week her parents bought the house that would define the family's public image of stability, escaped the pattern entirely, and even she would spend the last decades of her long life quietly gathering her family's scattered griefs into a single churchyard, so that all 5 of them, finally, could rest in the same ground. He gave the world everything. It was never going to be enough for the 5 people who needed him most.